Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Every year, for the past 35 years, Ipso Mori, the UK market research company, has undertaken a survey of which professions in Britain people trust. They ask 1,000 people each year which professions they trust to tell the truth. Near the bottom come business leaders, just ahead of estate agents, football players, the media and politicians, and below trade union officials and the man in the street. And it's not just a banker's phenomenon, because they actually come below bankers. And it's not a post-financial crisis phenomenon. It's been a feature of the survey for nearly all of its 35 years since 1983. Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive, and persistent. Why is that the case? The answer is this: what is termed the Friedman Doctrine after Milton Friedman. There is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits, so long as it plays by the rules of the game. That has been the basis of business policy, business practice, and business education around the world for the past 60 years. But it wasn't always so. Indeed, the corporation had a very different origin under Roman law, the Societas Publicanorum, which was established to perform public functions such as collecting taxes, minting coins, looking after the public buildings, and building public infrastructure. And then it took the form of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, the Catholic Church, and municipalities, the administration of municipalities. But meanwhile, or at least several centuries earlier, in Babylon, under the Code of Hammurabi between 1792 and 1750 BC, there was a form of contract known as the taputum, which said that if one man gives silver to another man in partnership, they shall share the profits or losses as there may be in proportion before a god. Now that notion of a partnership contract was then the basis of development of commercial activities, in particular in the Middle East. And it was the basis of the rise of the Islamic Golden Age between the 7th century AD and the 13th century AD, largely on the back of such a partnership contract known as the Mudaraba. And then this partnership contract spread to Europe in the form of what was termed the Comenda in 1072, and subsequently in the form that was known as the compagnia, cumpanes, to share bread. That was the notion of a company, to share bread. It was the basis of the super companies, such as the Bardi firm, the Peruzzi, and the Medici family companies. But then the most important development occurred in terms of the history of business, when that corporate form, which took by then the form of the guilds, the professional guilds, merged with the partnership, because essentially the corporation was almost an administrative function in the form of universities and the church and municipalities. And it merged with this way of raising money and financing commercial activities through a partnership to create the corporation as we know it today. And then we observe what I've termed the 6 ages of the corporation. First, the merchant trading company, such as the East India Company, which engaged in discovery around the world and setting up merchant trading. The second age was the public firm that built the railroads and the canals in Europe and in North America in particular. And the third age was then the private corporation and the rise of manufacturing industry. The fourth age was the service firm and the growth of financial services. The fifth was the transnational corporation, running rings around nations and putting a girdle around the earth. And the last age, the sixth age, which we're currently going through, is what I've termed the mindful corporation, like the social network companies, which are without men, without machines, without money, without basically anything. Now, those various developments through the age show a number of important features. First of all, the origins of the corporation was in a very public function. Secondly, there was actually a separation between that public administration function and commercial functions. And thirdly, that it was innovation in corporate form and business that has been probably one of the major sources of growth and prosperity around the world over the past several millennia. Now, in terms of the thinking that went on around that development of the corporation, probably the most important development was in the Age of Enlightenment, and in particular, the works of Adam Smith, who looked at business as being a source of specialization of labor, and thereby the creation of substantial amounts of economic prosperity. But he saw this happening in the form of small companies. Large companies, he believed, were afflicted with conflicts of interest, so much so that he said the business must necessarily be imbued with conflicts of interest. And it was only because most of the large corporations that he saw in his day were licensed by government and by royalty that he did not believe that the corporation was destined to fail. And 100 years later, after the emergence of the private corporation, we see that it's still in the hands predominantly of families that are dependent on their nation states. And so, for example, Alfred Marshall, the father of industrial economics, noted at the end of the 19th century that it's a strong proof of a marvelous growth of a spirit of honesty and uprightness in commercial matters that the leading officers of our great companies yield as little as they do to the vast temptations of fraud that lie in their way. He saw companies as being owned and controlled in many cases by families that were of great integrity, families such as the Cadbury family, the Rowntree's family, most of them of Quaker origin. It's when we come to the 20th century that things begin to change. And when we come to those ages of the service company, financial service companies, and the transnational company, that we observe companies becoming timeless and footloose, no longer tied down to their nation states. And in particular, what we observe happening during the 20th century is the growth of stock markets and ownership on stock markets, first in the hands of individual owners, and then increasingly in the hands of institutional investors. And as that happened, there was a steady dispersion of ownership. Instead of it being concentrated either in the hands of the families or in the hands of the state, we observe that it's dispersed among lots of institutional investors. And as that happened, what occurred was what Burl and Means described as being the separation of ownership and control. That is to say, there was no one who was still overseeing what management was doing, and as a consequence, there was a lack of accountability of management. And the response to that was the creation of what has been termed the markets for corporate control. Initially, it took the form of the takeover markets and the growth of hostile takeover activities around the world. And then, more recently, it's taken the form of hedge fund activism. And the consequence of this happening over the last 60 years has been that there has been a steady focusing on just one objective, the objective of profit. And the consequence of that has been growing inequality, environmental degradation, and the mistrust that I explained at the beginning. And it's going to get worse because of technological changes. Now, technological changes offer fantastic opportunities for increasing human prosperity. But at the same time, it poses many risks and many potential hazards, both of an environmental sort and of a social and human element, not least in terms of the potential substitution of humans by machines. And as that technology accelerates, it also creates a greater problem about policy, public policy, towards the corporation, because the lag of regulation behind those commercial innovations becomes longer and longer, and policy becomes more out of date. We are therefore facing serious problems of both a distributional sort, not just in terms of the income disparity between those who are at the top of corporations and those on the shop floor, but more seriously in terms of a wealth disparity between those who own and those who don't own businesses, and thereby a disparity in control as well as in wealth. And it's not just a distributional problem. There's an efficiency problem, because that breakdown of trust has real economic consequences, not just for society and us as humans, but also in terms of the performance of companies themselves, their economic and financial performance. And to address these problems, we need to go through a process of reinventing the corporation, reinventing it around three principal themes. The first is the purpose of corporations. Purpose is why something is created, is done, and exists. It's what it aspires to become. We should reformulate our notions of business around the purpose of business, and in so doing, recognize the importance of the trustworthiness of business and the significance of the values and culture of those businesses in promoting that trustworthiness. The purpose of business is not to produce profits. The purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And not to profit from producing problems for people and planet. In the process, it produces profits. But profits are not per se the purpose of business. In doing this, what companies do is to commit to their corporate purpose, to their common purpose. And they commit to those who help to create that common purpose. And those people in turn then commit to the company to create that common purpose. And that creates reciprocal relations of trust that are of mutual benefit to both the parties to the firm and to the firm itself. It creates more loyal customers, more engaged employees, more reliable suppliers, more supportive shareholders and societies. It therefore creates greater revenues, lower costs, and therefore higher profits for companies. Now, in doing this, it's critical to recognize that these are not just bland statements. They are commitments. They are commitments by the company to their stated purposes and to the people and planet involved in their creation. And that trustworthiness comes from the nature of the values of the organization. And those values are instilled in its culture. Culture of honesty, integrity, and a commitment to the common purpose of the company. And that culture has to be led from the top of the organization right through the corporation, from the board to the shop floor. And if that happens, if we can create companies around their purposes, their trustworthiness, and their cultures that enable that trustworthiness and purpose, then we will really have established something that is of significance for current and future generations. Now, there are 5 key components or levers in terms of achieving this outcome. The first is ownership. Ownership is conventionally associated with shareholders. That's a mistake. It comes from the notion that shareholders are the residual claimants in terms of the success and failure of companies. It comes from a property view of the company as shareholders, as the owners of the property of the company. That is a mistake. Ownership is ownership of the corporate purpose and the promotion of that corporate purpose. And there are many parties that can play that role of owners and should play that part. The form of families, or employees, or customers, or the state, or sovereign funds, or individuals and institutional owners. And there's one form that's in particular important in this regard, and that is the form for which some of the most successful companies in the world take. Companies such as Bosch and Bertelsmann, Carlsberg, IKEA, Velux, and Tata. They're all owned by industrial foundations. And those foundations have a philanthropic objective, but the more significant element is that they provide the oversight of the companies that they own. And in particular, the function of the boards of those foundations is to instill the purpose and values of the founders of those corporations and ensure that they're embedded and remain embedded in the corporations below them. And that form of ownership brings out several critical elements associated with the corporation. And that is, first of all, the foundation is not something that as such derives from financial capital. It almost brings back the notion of what I was talking about in terms of the history of the corporation. That there is one party that is associated with the purpose and the values, that is the board of the foundation, and there is another party that is associated with the commercial matters and the commercial implementation, that is the operating boards of the companies. And that comes on to the second key element, and that is corporate governance. Corporate governance is currently associated with the alignment of managerial interests with those of shareholders and the promotion of shareholder value alone. That is a mistake. Corporate governance is about the implementation of corporate purpose. And the role of boards is that of ensuring that that corporate purpose is reflected in the values and the culture of the organization. And the board should have mechanisms for being able to measure and evaluate the extent to which the company is fulfilling its corporate purposes. It requires the metrics to be able to do that, and those metrics should then be the factors that determine how people are rewarded and promoted in the organization, not just the profitability. So corporate governance, again, and that element is illustrated by that structure and the foundations of essentially having one level at which the values and the purposes reside and another at which the implementation of it takes place. The third element, which is key to the achievement of this, are laws and regulation. Corporate law should be the mechanism by which companies are enabled to adopt their corporate purposes and required to state their corporate purposes. It should provide the mechanisms by which companies can set up the ownership structures and the governance structures that are required to deliver on their corporate purposes. And because there should be a multivariate form of corporate purposes around the world, we need a wide variety of ownership and governance structures. That's what law should enable. Regulation is there to ensure that where necessary, there is an alignment between the private purposes of companies and their public purposes and their social purposes. And that's particularly important in companies where they play a profound public role. For example, in relation to utilities, companies with significant market power, companies that provide audit functions, banks, infrastructure companies, and the like. And that comes on to the fourth element, which is key to the development of this, and that is taxation. Corporate taxation has basically been annulled because of the ability of companies to source their domicile of tax in whatever country offers the lowest rates of taxation. And as a consequence, companies basically now are in a position where they can avoid or minimize their tax levels. So long as the sole purpose of companies is to maximize profits, minimize costs, and to minimize their tax burden, without recognizing the benefits that they derive from society and thereby their responsibilities to society, then the future of corporation tax is in doubt. And that brings us on to the fifth element, and that is the partnership between government and business, in particular in terms of major investments for the benefit of society in the form of infrastructure investments, in the form of the provision of social services that require substantial amounts of investment. That requires a real partnership in which companies that are providing it have clear public purposes through, for example, including their license conditions to operate in their articles of association, thereby putting a fiduciary responsibility on directors to uphold their public as well as their private purposes. Now, those 5 instruments of ownership, governance, laws and regulation, taxation, and investment offer the prospect of really creating corporations that fulfill public purposes in a trustworthy fashion. And there are many initiatives going on around the world. In my country, in the UK, the government has just introduced a new corporate governance code that puts corporate purpose at the center of corporate governance and requires companies to demonstrate how they're upholding those public purposes. The opposition party in Britain is for the first time recently putting forward the notion of employee ownership as being a required feature of UK companies. In France, we see President Macron putting forward the notion of the raison d'etre as being central to French civil code in the future. In the United States, Elizabeth Warren has been putting forward the notion that large companies in excess of $1 billion of revenue should be required to be chartered. There are initiatives going on around the world, but we need a recognition that there is something more fundamental than just a piecemeal set of reforms, that we have to reform our notion of what business is, and that there are then multiple levers that are going to be required to affect the change that is needed. And I want to end by illustrating why I think that this is of such significance. Because if you contrast the conventional view of the corporation as being its purpose to produce profits, and in the process, perhaps to produce benefits for the rest of society, with what I'm suggesting is the purpose of the corporation, to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, then the first is essentially an extrinsic notion of purpose. It's saying that the fundamental objective is profits and social benefits may be a byproduct, as against what I'm suggesting it should be, is that is intrinsic profit, an intrinsic notion of contributing to social well-being. And the way in which the conventional view looks at this as being achieved is through contracts and markets, in particular competitive markets. And it's motivated through financial incentives, as against what comes out of the notion of the purpose of companies as being a broader social one, is that it is brought about through trust and trustworthiness, and through values, multiple values, and the notion of supportive cultures of integrity and honesty and the promotion of corporate purpose. Now that then really illustrates that there are two worlds that we can live in. One, a very exploitative world in which essentially the issues that I was describing at the beginning in terms of distributional inequity and economic inefficiency will get worse as technological advances progress. Or the alternative world that I've just been describing, in which there is a real notion of what business is there to do, what its origins were, and what through nearly all of its 2,000-year history as a corporation it has taken the form of, namely as an agent that produces public benefits as well as its normal commercial activities. And it's only over the last 60 years since that Friedman doctrine that we have basically taken the wrong path. And that wrong path is imposing ever greater costs on us. We need to re-find the right path and go along that path for the prosperity of the many, not the few, and the prosperity of the future as well as the present. Thank you very much.